This is London. It's the capital of England, and yet it barely feels English at all, let alone British or, well, UK-ish. It has no single centre, and it's been shaped less by what was planned and more by what was never designed, after 1,000 old villages quietly merged into one. But how did it end up like this? How did London become the most iconic cultural city in Britain while being the one that looks the least like the rest of it? Well, contrary to popular belief, it doesn't begin with the post-war rebuild or even with the Great Fire of London, but rather centuries earlier. See, London didn't start as one city. It started as two. There was the City of London, Londinium back then, the original square mile, a walled trading town first founded by the Romans and built entirely on money. And then there was Westminster, a completely separate settlement upriver, built around the Abbey and the Crown. That split has a specific origin. In 1065, King Edward the Confessor moved his court out to Westminster to closely oversee the rebuilding of Westminster Abbey. So the government followed him out there, and from that point on, London had two hearts instead of one, a city of money and a city of power, with open country in between them, governmentally separate to this day. Now, around those two city centres sat dozens of independent little villages. Chelsea, Hampstead, Greenwich, Camberwell, each one its own parish within its own core. London didn't grow outward from one heart the way a normal city does. It grew by slowly swallowing all of these separate places, one by one over centuries. There was never a master plan stitching them together, because there was never one centre to plan from. And that's the reason Londoners still navigate the city by neighbourhood names rather than by some grand centre. This sets London apart from the cities that would later become Manchester, Birmingham, or Glasgow, places that got built deliberately around a single industrial-era civic core, with one grand town hall standing in the middle announcing exactly where the centre was. And then, almost unbelievably, London was handed the chance to throw all of that out and start over. In September 1666, the Great Fire tore through the city and burned most of the old square mile to the ground. It started just after midnight in a baker's shop on Pudding Lane. 4 days later, about 13,000 houses and 87 churches were gone, with 100,000 people displaced. 80% of the city was simply erased. A blank canvas, right in the middle of the most important city in the country. As a result, there were 5 major plans drawn up in the weeks after the flames went out, and every single one of them imagined a completely different London. The most famous one was from Christopher Wren, the architect who would later design the new St. Paul's. He proposed wide, straight boulevards and grand open plazas, inspired by Paris. But none of it happened. See, the land underneath all that ash was owned by thousands of separate people, sitting on thousands of separate medieval plots. And those people wanted their own ground back, exactly where it had been, not a slot in somebody else's master plan. Not one of Wren's streets actually lined up with the old property boundaries, which meant building his version would have required redrawing every land title in the city. The King, Charles II, didn't have the money or the authority to force that through, and the city's wealthy merchants, the same ones lending him the money for his war with the Dutch at the time, wanted one thing above all else, which was to rebuild on their own foundation. So instead of a grand redesign, London got a little regulation. The Act for the Rebuilding of the City of London, signed into law in February 1667, kept almost the exact old street lines. The King's only real wins were small ones. The streets got slightly widened, sorted into a few standard widths, and buildings now had to be brick or stone instead of timber. But essentially, London was rebuilt right on top of its medieval street plan. And that decision, putting private land rights ahead of any master plan, became the template for the next 350 years. As London exploded outward through the 1700s and 1800s, its design was driven almost entirely by private aristocratic landowners, who each happened to own enormous estates of land just west of the old city, and who each developed their own patch into the elegant squares and terraces of what became the West End. For example, with the Grosvenor estate, it traces back to 1677, when Sir Thomas Grosvenor married a 12-year-old heiress named Mary Davies, which brought into the family a few hundred acres of marsh and pasture west of town. That marsh is now Mayfair and Belgravia. Each estate was built to its own design by its own landlord, and then just stitched onto the edge of whatever was already there. There was no central authority shaping the whole thing. In fact, London didn't get a single elected government for the entire urban area until the London County Council in 1889. And on top of that, the ancient City of London, the Square Mile, simply refused to join in. It kept its independence, its own Lord Mayor, its own police, 1,000-year-old government, and it still has all of that today. The very center of the city opted out of being governed with the rest of it. Meanwhile, look at what the rest of Britain was doing at exactly the same time. This was the age of what was called the civic gospel, when powerful city governments built grand centers deliberately as a statement. Birmingham cleared out slums and drove a brand new boulevard, Corporation Street, straight through its heart, purely as an act of municipal will. Edinburgh laid out an entire new town from 1767, a planned grid built around Charlotte Square and St. Andrew's Square as a single coherent statement. Liverpool built its grandeur on purpose, raising St. George's Hall as a neoclassical temple before lining its waterfront with the Three Graces, deliberately giving the city a monumental face. These cities chose to rebuild themselves a center. By 1900, London was by far the largest city in the world, with a metro population of over 6 million people, fueled by the Industrial Revolution and the height of the British Empire, which, as we'll get to later, will also play a part in London's uniqueness to the UK. But anyways, 4 decades later, the destruction of London happened again, except far worse during World War II. It was known as the Blitz, an 8-month period from September of 1940 when the Germans dropped more than 18,000 tons of bombs on the city. More than 50,000 inner London homes were completely destroyed and over 2 million were damaged. Once more, planners showed up with a grand vision. The 1943 County of London Plan and the Greater London Plan of 1944, both led by a planner named Patrick Abercrombie, were the main ones. It was a sweeping modernist redesign, rings of new motorways cutting across the city, rationalized land used, and the medieval city finally straightened out into something orderly. But there was something even bolder buried inside Abercrombie's plan. The whole point wasn't just to rebuild London, it was to shrink it. The plan called for moving more than 1 million people out of the city entirely, into a ring of brand new towns built from scratch in the countryside, places like Stevenage and Harlow. The thinking, which had been building for years in government, was that London had grown so dominant that it was actually draining the rest of the country. One royal commission literally called Greater London a national menace. So the solution on the table was to deliberately demagnetize the capital, to pull people and jobs out of it on purpose for the good of Britain. But once more, almost none of the plans actually happened. Britain came out of the war essentially bankrupt. The land was still as fragmented as it had always been, and the political will just wasn't there. Abercrombie's inner motorway ring alone would have demolished more houses than the Blitz did, so the city simply rebuilt on its old lines a second time. But crucially, other British cities didn't refuse. Coventry, which had been flattened in a single devastating raid, rebuilt its core as a clean, deliberate modernist centre, with one of the first pedestrian shopping precincts in Europe. Birmingham rebuilt its centre almost entirely around the car, wrapping it in an inner ring road. Glasgow drove motorways straight through the middle of itself. These cities completely redrew themselves, sometimes beautifully, often brutally. But there was one idea of Abercrombie's that did stick, and it changed everything. The Green Belt. A ring of protected open land was drawn around the entire city, which now covers almost 1.3 million acres of land. The intent was partly to give Londoners countryside to escape into, and partly to stop the city from sprawling endlessly outward. The effect, though, was to trap a still-growing city inside a hard, fixed boundary. No endless sprawl. And this is the moment where London's physical shape and its economy first run into each other, because the supply of land got frozen just a few years before the moment demand was about to explode. That moment, of course, being deindustrialization. Britain deindustrialized faster and harder than almost any rich country on Earth. Across British cities, manufacturing went from making up nearly a third of all jobs in 1981 to just 1 in 8 a decade later. The places that had been deliberately built around industry, Manchester, Birmingham, Glasgow, Sheffield, Liverpool, lost the very thing they'd been built for. and as a result, lost a lot of their population too. London took a hit too, don't get me wrong, but it had never really been a manufacturing city in the same way. Its economy had always leaned on trade, finance, services, and the port. So when industry collapsed across Britain, London was the one place positioned to pivot into something else, if not already past it. The rest of the country wasn't. Soon, things got even crazier. On October 27, 1986, the government deregulated the London Stock Exchange overnight, in a single sweeping change referred to as the Big Bang. When it happened, the market was thrown open to foreign firms. International banks flooded in. Of the roughly 300 member firms, all of them British beforehand, 75 were foreign-owned within a single year. London went from an insular, exclusive hub trading just 1/13 of New York's volume to one of the two great financial capitals on the planet, alongside New York itself. It enabled an entirely new financial district to rise from the old Docklands 3 miles east, at Canary Wharf. So now we go to the modern day, and the gap that all of this opened up is genuinely staggering. London accounts for about 22% of the UK's economic output. Its productivity per hour is 26% higher than the rest of the country's. The gap in productivity between the Southeast and London versus the rest of Britain is now wider than the gap between East and West Germany, or North and South Italy. This isn't the usual story of the capital dominating everything, because Britain's other big cities, like Manchester and Birmingham, actually underperform for their size, with weirdly low productivity for how many people live there. And London manages all of this over tiny distances. London and Manchester are 160 miles apart, and economically they might as well be different nations. Leeds is even closer, yet they're the largest city in Western Europe without any kind of metro. Today, London is still decentralized. The financial power sits in the square mile. The newer money is at Canary Wharf. The shops and theatres cluster in the West End. The government sits in Westminster. And the London Underground, or Tube, is by far better than any other UK cities, with 11 lines and 272 stations, serving over 1 billion people annually. Administratively, Greater London is partitioned into 32 boroughs because it's so big, while the other major cities are under single unitary authorities. Lastly, there's one more way London is truly unlike other British cities, and it's the most visible one of all. It's who actually lives there. By a massive margin, London is the most diverse city in the country. Approximately 41% of Londoners were born outside the UK. This is basically double the average for the rest of England's major cities, where about 21% of residents were born abroad. Over 300 languages are spoken there. Whole neighborhoods are organized around communities from a specific corner of the world. Over in the square mile, basically half of the workers were born outside the UK. It's the result of being a global city on top of the British Empire's colonial history, resulting in many of their former subjects moving there. What this has all led to is London being a city unlike anywhere else in the UK, despite being its cultural capital and heart of all major attractions, from Big Ben, the London Eye, Buckingham Palace, the Tower of London, Westminster, and many more. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more content like this. I'll see you in the next one.